The midday heat hung heavily over the small Texas town, a stifling blanket of humidity and dust, mixing into a thick haze that drove everyone to seek refuge under air conditioners. Main Street stretched on, long and straight like an invisible line, when a shiny black SUV emerged in the distance. The sun glinted off its perfectly polished surface, creating a mirage that made it appear as though the vehicle was floating above the blistering asphalt. Officer Darrell Smith sat in his patrol car, bored and sipping cold coffee from a plastic cup. It had been a quiet day. No accidents, no violations, just heat and silence. Suddenly his radar beeped, and the speed on the screen flashed 72 miles per hour, well over the 55 miles per hour limit. "Here we go," Smith muttered under his breath, setting the coffee cup down and flipping on his lights as he sped after the SUV. The vehicle didn't slow down, but Smith wasn't worried. He was sure no one could outrun the law in his town. His face took on an expression of calm indifference with a slight sense of satisfaction. This was the part that made sitting through the dull hours of the day worthwhile. When the SUV finally pulled over, Smith slammed on the brakes, got out of his car, and instinctively adjusted his belt and hat. The SUV sat motionless, as if waiting for him. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a well-fitted dark blue suit stepped out, his posture and composed demeanor immediately noticeable. Smith, however, didn't take much notice of it. "Let's see who's so important," the officer muttered to himself as he walked toward the car. Stopping a couple of feet from the driver, he expected the usual defiance or excuses. "License and registration," he said, his voice firm and mechanical, barely looking at the man. It was just the standard procedure. Request the documents, write the ticket, and move on. However, when the driver handed over his ID, Officer Darrell Smith's hand shook slightly as he read the name on the ID, General Lewis Johnson. Smith couldn't believe his eyes. He had heard the name in the news, with Johnson's military background and heroic status from leading operations overseas. He was a hero to many. But Smith pushed those thoughts aside, his heart racing with a mix of anger and self-righteous certainty. "You know you were speeding," Smith said harshly, disregarding the rank printed on the ID. The man in front of him remained calm. "Speeding," Johnson replied, his voice steady and controlled, as if he were used to handling tense situations without losing his composure. But that calmness only fueled Smith's anger. A flood of thoughts raced through his mind. Why was this guy so composed? Did he think he was above the law? Smith had always distrusted people like him, wealthy, influential, successful, those who seemed to think they could get away with anything. Smith had fought through his own struggles in life, and he was certain that people like General Johnson didn't understand real hardship. "Put your hands on the car," Smith demanded, his voice rising. Johnson hesitated for a moment, but sensing it was better to comply than escalate things, he obeyed. Inside, Smith's anger was reaching a boiling point. It felt like his moment to act, like there was a darker side to him that had been waiting for an opportunity to release built-up frustration. And here, in this man who seemed too proud and self-assured, he found that outlet. Smith moved closer to the general, abruptly grabbing his wrist and twisting his arm behind his back. Johnson's gaze remained cool and unreadable, but he didn't resist. "What's this about?" Johnson asked, turning his head to meet Smith's eyes. His calmness sparked something deeper in Smith, something more unsettling than just irritation. There was a flicker of fear and anxiety that Smith wasn't ready to confront. "We're going to check for anything illegal in your car," Smith responded, even though he had no real reason to suspect anything. In his mind, the arrest was already made. This was just another case of a wealthy man thinking he could rely on his status to escape consequences. Despite his thoughts, Johnson didn't protest. But just as Smith reached for his handcuffs, ready to place them on the general, something went wrong. At that exact moment, a police car from another department drove by. Smith didn't notice it, nor did he see the second officer pulling over nearby to watch the scene unfold. "Darrell, what's going on?" called a voice. It was Lieutenant Rodriguez, one of the few people Smith respected in town. "Just detaining a violator," Smith grunted, not looking at his colleague. He kept his focus on Johnson, still determined to make the arrest. The handcuffs were still in Smith's hands when Rodriguez stepped forward. His eyes widened when he saw the man standing in front of Smith. "Darrell, that's General Johnson," Rodriguez said, his voice sharp, signaling Smith to stop. Smith froze for a moment, uncertainty creeping in as he processed the information. He had heard the name before, but he couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. His instincts told him to halt, but he had ignored them. The realization hit him late. Something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Rodriguez, on the other hand, understood the gravity of the situation. You didn't treat people like this, especially based on prejudice. "Do you really think General Johnson has done something serious enough to arrest him?" he asked, stepping closer to Smith. Smith's heart pounded in his chest, his inner voice urging him to stop, but his pride and stubbornness held him back. He glanced at Rodriguez, then back at Johnson, who remained composed. "It doesn't matter who he is," Smith snapped, trying to assert control. "No one is above the law." Rodriguez paused, knowing Smith well enough to understand his mindset. Smith was typically direct, sometimes even harsh, especially when it came to authority. But this time, Rodriguez felt something was wrong. He knew it wasn't just about the law. It was about bias. "Listen," Rodriguez began, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe this isn't what you think, Darrell. Let's talk. Let him go, and we'll figure it out." "Are you kidding me?" Smith shot back, turning toward Rodriguez with aggression. "This guy thinks he can do whatever he wants. Look at him, standing there like he doesn't care. Maybe he's hiding drugs or weapons in the car." At that moment, Johnson finally turned toward Smith, his face unreadable, but a spark of something appeared in his eyes. It wasn't anger, but disappointment. He'd seen this type of situation many times before, where the system he had served betrayed those it was meant to protect. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong except speeding, and I take full responsibility for that," Johnson said calmly. "But if you think you can intimidate me just because I'm black, you are gravely mistaken." Smith's anger flared at the words. He couldn't tolerate being spoken to like that, especially not by someone he had already judged. His mind spun with justifications and images, reinforcing his convictions. To him, Johnson was just another arrogant person trying to use their status to avoid consequences. Smith stepped forward, his face inches from Johnson's. "You're not getting away with this," he hissed. "You're going to pay for your attitude." Before Smith could do anything further, Rodriguez grabbed his arm. "Darrell, stop!" Rodriguez's voice was firmer now, carrying an authority Smith rarely heard. "You're making a huge mistake." Smith froze, pulling his arm away sharply. "What are you doing, Rodriguez? I'm in control here," he snapped. "I'm not going to let you get away with breaking the law," Smith snapped, his voice sharp. Rodriguez sighed, realizing that talking wasn't going to stop his partner. He pulled out his phone and began recording the scene. Smith's anger flared when he noticed the movement, and he turned on Rodriguez, shouting, "What are you doing?" Rodriguez remained calm, his expression unwavering. "I'm recording so we have evidence," he replied coldly. "If you keep going, you're only going to make this worse for yourself." The tension in the air was suddenly broken by the sound of another car pulling up. A man in a suit stepped out, someone Smith didn't recognize at first. But as the man approached, Smith realized he was a journalist, possibly from the local news or a television station. The journalist quickly pulled out a camera and began filming the scene. Smith's frustration grew as the situation spiraled out of control. His instincts screamed at him to stop, but pride and rage consumed him. He grabbed Johnson by the shoulder, trying to push him onto the hood of the car to cuff him, but the general swiftly twisted his arm out of Smith's grip, standing tall and meeting his eyes. "This will be your last mistake," Johnson said, his voice calm but firm. "And not because I'm a general, but because I'm a citizen of this country, and I won't allow you to violate my rights." Smith froze, shocked by the response. He no longer knew how to move forward. A small crowd had gathered, watching intently, and the journalist continued filming. Rodriguez stood nearby, his phone still trained on Smith. All Smith had wanted was to come out on top, but in that moment, he realized he had already lost. Johnson took a step back and sighed. "I'm not here to break the law," he said, his voice composed. "But you, officer, will have to answer for your actions." Cold sweat began to trickle down Smith's back as the weight of the situation sank in. He had gone too far. His fists clenched, and his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. How had it all gone so wrong? This was supposed to be simple. Stop a violator, write a ticket, and move on. But now everything screamed that he had crossed a line, and standing in front of him was a man who, despite his calm demeanor, was no longer just a violator. He had become a symbol of everything Smith had always resented. "Smith, stop!" Rodriguez called out again, his voice firm. "You're losing it! Stop before it's too late!" But Smith couldn't hear him anymore. He was consumed by anger, a mix of frustration and fear for his career. His eyes locked with Johnson's, and in them he saw not just confidence, but knowledge, the knowledge that Smith had no right to act this way. Every step he had taken had been a violation, not an enforcement of the law. What made Smith uneasy was that Johnson wasn't retaliating. He didn't speak threats, just absolute certainty that the law was on his side and Smith had crossed a line he couldn't undo. Johnson's calm confidence was terrifying. He stood there like a man who knew his own truth, and it disarmed Smith more effectively than any threats ever could. "I'm not done yet," Smith growled, his jaw clenched, though his voice betrayed a crack of doubt. He was still trying to hold on to control, but it was slipping away from him. Around them, the bystanders were whispering, a few already pulling out their phones to record the scene. This was the problem Smith hadn't been willing to admit until now. He wasn't alone. His actions were now public, and Rodriguez's recording only confirmed the uncomfortable truth. One wrong move, and Smith's career could end right there. "Officer Smith," Johnson's calm voice broke the silence, "I'm giving you one last chance. We both know this has gone too far. I don't want you to lose your job, but if you keep going, the consequences will be severe." Smith felt a punch to his gut. An ordinary violator wouldn't speak like that, but Johnson wasn't ordinary. He wasn't just a suspect. He was someone who commanded respect. Smith's insides tightened, and for a moment, he almost attacked again. But Johnson's steady demeanor, his quiet confidence, made Smith hesitate. How far was he willing to go, and what would the fallout be? "Are you threatening me?" Smith shot back, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Johnson smiled slightly. "I'm just reminding you that we all have responsibilities, even those who wear a badge." Smith's mind was reeling, and his words felt empty against Johnson's calm, certain presence. For the first time in a long time, Smith felt powerless, an unacceptable feeling for a law officer. What was worse, he realized, was that he no longer controlled the situation. He tried to focus. He could just let Johnson go and end it all here. But what would people think? What would his superiors say? Anger swelled in his chest, drowning any remnants of reason. But deep down, Smith knew one thing. If he didn't stop now, the consequences would be catastrophic. Taking a deep breath, Smith finally loosened his grip on Johnson's arm. "All right," he growled, suppressing the fury within. "You can go." But Johnson didn't move. He met Smith's gaze, studying his reaction. Every moment was being recorded, and every move mattered. "You're lucky I'm not filing a complaint," Johnson said, his voice steady. "But remember, it's not because you were right. It's because someone had to teach you how to act properly." Smith didn't respond. He turned away, walking back to his patrol car, his head lowered as the weight of the crowd's stares pressed down on him. He had lost, and it was clear to everyone. The most painful part, however, was knowing that he was the one who had lost control. When Smith sat back in his patrol car, his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his fingers trembled. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a mistake he could never undo. And now he understood the full weight of it. The weight of the consequences quickly caught up with Smith, faster than he had expected. Johnson, undisturbed, calmly got into his SUV, started the engine, and drove away, leaving behind a whirlwind of emotions and disappointment. Rodriguez pocketed his phone and walked over to Smith's car. "You really crossed the line, Darrell," Rodriguez said quietly, his tone serious. "I have everything recorded, If you hadn't stopped, this could have ended your career." Smith didn't reply, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He was consumed by the full realization of his actions, feeling as though the consequences of his decisions were crashing down on him. Though he had stopped, he knew the moment to rectify everything had already passed. Unaware, Smith didn't know that the video of the incident had already gone viral, spreading quickly across the internet. He only found out when he walked into the station, and the fury of his superiors hit him full force. But the worst was yet to come. His face, his actions, were now being discussed on live television. He had become a national figure, but not the way he had ever imagined. He was now an anti-hero. Days passed, but the silence in the station told a different story. Smith couldn't help but feel the cold atmosphere as his colleagues went quiet. Whenever he walked by, every whispered conversation, every furtive glance behind his back felt sharper than any public accusation. The tension was unbearable. Smith entered his office, trying to push everything from his mind as he settled into his chair. Out of habit, he opened a folder of reports, hoping to distract himself with routine work. But it was impossible. His mind kept returning to General Johnson. His calm, confident face lingered in Smith's thoughts, haunting him every time he closed his eyes. It wasn't just a simple roadside encounter. Smith felt like he had unknowingly stepped into something much larger that was beginning to spiral out of control. His thoughts were interrupted when Captain Harkness walked in. Harkness was the type who rarely interfered in his officers' matters unless absolutely necessary, and the expression on his face told Smith that today was one of those moments. "Darrell, come to my office," Harkness said tersely, not even looking up from the papers on his desk. Smith felt an unsettling chill run down his spine from the captain's tone. He rose from his desk and walked toward Harkness's office, aware of the weight of his colleagues' stares on his back. Once inside, Harkness gestured for Smith to take a seat. As Smith sat down, the captain let out a heavy sigh, folding his hands in front of him. Smith immediately noticed the headline on the desk: "Police Aggression Against U.S. Hero, General Johnson's Roadside Encounter." His stomach sank as he realized what this was about. "You know the video of your stop is everywhere, right?" Harkness asked coldly, his gaze fixed on Smith. Smith nodded, his throat tightening as helplessness began to settle in. "Damn it, Darrell," Harkness continued, his irritation evident. "Did you really think this would just disappear? That someone like Johnson wouldn't use his influence? This isn't a small mistake. This is a major blow to the department's reputation." Smith opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, rendered everything else insignificant. Smith's hand shook as he tried to steady the glass, the weight of what had happened sinking deeper into his chest. He was used to challenges, to difficult calls and moments of tension, but it was different. This time, he wasn't just facing a momentary setback. He was standing at the edge of his career, maybe even his entire future. Turning back toward the living room, he saw the news report again. Johnson's calm demeanor only made it worse, a stark contrast to the chaos that Smith was now in. The words Johnson had spoken on national television were like daggers, each one cutting into Smith's integrity. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was the embodiment of everything wrong with the system that he had once believed in. And it wasn't just the people in his department who saw it. It was the whole country. Smith's eyes flickered over to his phone again, the buzzing notifications relentless. They were everywhere, the video, the comments, the outrage. His face had become a symbol of all the things people despised. And in that moment, Smith realized that there was no hiding from it. What happens next? That question kept looping in his mind, but the answer seemed more and more out of reach. He could feel his life unraveling, piece by piece. Each notification, each comment on the video was a reminder that the moment he had thought he could control had slipped beyond his grasp. Smith placed the glass down and stood there for a moment, staring at the news report. Every fiber of his being wanted to reject what was happening, to deny that this was his reality now, but the truth was undeniable. He was trapped in the aftermath of his own actions, and no amount of excuses could change that. General Johnson had turned Smith's life upside down. transforming him from a regular officer into a symbol of aggression and disdain. The phone rang, pulling Smith from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw the name, Lieutenant Rodriguez. Whenever he walked by, every whispered conversation, every furtive glance behind his back felt sharper than any public accusation. The tension was unbearable. Smith entered his office, trying to push everything from his mind as he settled into his chair. Out of habit, he opened a folder of reports, hoping to distract himself with routine work. But it was impossible. His mind kept returning to General Johnson. His calm, confident face lingered in Smith's thoughts, haunting him every time he closed his eyes. It wasn't just a simple roadside encounter. Smith felt like he had unknowingly stepped into something much larger that was beginning to spiral out of control. His thoughts were interrupted when Captain Harkness walked in. Harkness was the type who rarely interfered in his officers' matters unless absolutely necessary, and the expression on his face told Smith that today was one of those moments. "Darrell, come to my office," Harkness said tersely, not even looking up from the papers on his desk. Smith felt. He hung up the phone and slumped back onto the couch, staring blankly into space. All the stories he'd heard of colleagues under investigation suddenly felt like a distant, unreal concept. Until now. Now, he was the one caught in the trap. The next morning, Smith was jolted awake by a knock at the door. Every movement felt sluggish, as if his body was burdened by an invisible weight. He opened the door to find two men in formal suits. One of them introduced himself coldly as an FBI agent. "Officer Smith?" the agent asked, though he already knew the answer. Smith nodded, already knowing what this visit meant. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident with General Johnson," the agent continued, his tone devoid of empathy. Smith stepped aside, letting them in. They took seats across from him in the living room, the silence in the room growing tense. "Well, officer," the second agent began, breaking the stillness, "let's start with the basics. Why did you—" Smith struggled to gather his thoughts as the agents waited for him to speak. The incident with General Johnson was a blur in his memory, and even though he knew it was about speeding, it now seemed like a flimsy excuse. He eventually answered, "Yes, we know that," one of the agents responded, their tone flat. "But what we need to understand," the second agent continued, "is why your actions went beyond standard protocol. Why did you escalate the situation when there was no need for aggression?" Smith's fists clenched at the sharp questions. His guilt and shame only deepened, but he couldn't offer them a clear answer. His behavior that day had been driven by anger, pride, and prejudice, but admitting that was impossible. "I was just following my instincts," he muttered, his voice low. "He was too confident," Smith added quickly, trying to justify himself. "I thought he was hiding something." The second agent's tone grew colder. "And that was reason enough to use force?" Smith fell silent, feeling trapped. He could have insisted it was a misunderstanding or that he didn't mean to take it that far, but the truth was, it wouldn't change the outcome. "We'll continue the investigation," the agent finally said, standing up. "Expect further instructions, and we suggest you hire a lawyer." Smith nodded, watching them leave. As soon as the door clicked shut, he felt his body tense, overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. He sank to the floor, his head in his hands, wondering how everything had unraveled so completely. Days passed, and things only worsened. The news replayed the incident constantly, zooming in on his face, showing his actions from every angle. People in town began avoiding him, and even his neighbors stopped greeting him. But the most devastating blow came when Smith sat down at his computer one evening. He stumbled upon a live broadcast of General Johnson giving a speech. With calm authority, Johnson addressed the situation. "This isn't just an insult to my dignity," he said, his voice steady. "It's a demonstration of how the system can oppress and humiliate people simply because of their appearance. I don't want this to be just about me. I want this to start a conversation about police reform and how we can change the system for the better." Smith stared at the screen, feeling the weight of Johnson's words pierce through him. He thought about how everything could have been different. What if he had just let Johnson go? But now it was too late. He turned off the computer, standing up with a heavy heart. It felt as if the world around him was closing in, and he couldn't breathe. He needed to escape, to leave it all behind, but no matter where he went, the consequences of his actions would follow him. He walked over to the window and gazed out at the street. In the distance, a car slowly passed by, and in it he recognized the same faces, people who were once familiar, now distant and full of judgment. Smith knew that his life had spiraled beyond his control. Every action, every word, would be analyzed under a microscope. This was only the start of it. He closed his eyes, desperately searching for a way out, but deep down he understood the harsh truth. He had already lost.